The golden afternoon sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows of the historic Bellamy Ballroom, casting colorful patterns across the polished marble floor. Jessica looked at herself one last time in the antique full-length mirror, hardly believing the day had finally arrived. Her white dress, with its delicate lace overlay and modest train, had been her grandmother's final gift before passing away last spring. The seamstress had worked wonders updating it while preserving its vintage charm. "You look absolutely beautiful," whispered her mother, Catherine, blinking back tears as she adjusted the veil. "Your grandmother would be so proud." Jessica took a deep breath, trying to calm the butterflies in her stomach. She and Michael had been planning this day for nearly 18 months, saving every penny they could while juggling student loan payments and the down payment on their tiny starter home. 5 minutes, everyone, called the wedding coordinator, poking her head into the bridal suite. Jessica's 3 bridesmaids, dressed in soft blue gowns, gathered around her for one final check, smoothing a stray hair, adjusting a fallen strap, offering encouraging smiles. Across the building, Michael stood nervously in a small side room with his best friend Tommy and his father Richard. "Stop fidgeting with your tie," Tommy said, slapping Michael's hand away good-naturedly. "You'll wrinkle it before she even sees you." "I can't help it," Michael replied, his voice slightly shaky. "What if I forget my vows? What if I trip walking down the aisle? What if—" "Son," Richard interrupted, placing a steady hand on Michael's shoulder. "I felt exactly the same way when I married your mother 33 years ago. It's normal. Just remember why you're here today." Michael nodded, thinking of the first time he'd met Jessica at the university library 5 years ago. He'd been struggling with his engineering assignment, and she'd noticed him about to use the wrong formula. Their coffee date the next day had turned into dinner, which had turned into 5 years of building a life together. Outside, the historic ballroom was transforming from a ceremony space into a reception venue. Staff moved efficiently behind the scenes, their practiced motions nearly invisible to the 150 guests who were now mingling in the garden for the cocktail hour. White roses and baby's breath adorned every table, and tiny fairy lights were strung across the high ceiling, waiting to be lit once dusk fell. The ceremony itself had been everything Jessica had dreamed of since she was a little girl. Her father, James, usually so stoic and reserved, had tears in his eyes as he walked her down the aisle. The moment when Michael first saw her, his face lighting up with a mixture of awe and love, was something Jessica knew she would remember for the rest of her life. "Did you see Michael's face when Jess walked in?" whispered Penny, Jessica's cousin and bridesmaid, to another guest. "I swear I've never seen a man look at a woman that way." "That's how it should be," replied the older woman, who had been married for 42 years herself. "That boy is head over heels." The cocktail hour was in full swing now. Small groups formed and reformed as old friends reconnected, and family members who hadn't seen each other in years caught up on life's changes. Jessica's Uncle Bill, who had traveled all the way from Australia, was entertaining a group with stories of the wildlife in his backyard. Michael's grandmother, Dot, at 92 the oldest guest present, held court from a comfortable chair, receiving visitors who came to pay their respects. In the kitchen, the catering staff was putting the finishing touches on the dinner service. The head chef, a friend of Jessica's father who had offered his services at a reduced rate as a wedding gift, tasted the sauce one last time before nodding in satisfaction. "First course in 15 minutes, he announced to his team. "Let's make this perfect." Meanwhile, the newly married couple took a moment alone in a quiet corner of the garden. "Mrs. Chen," Michael said softly, still getting used to the sound of Jessica's new name. "How does it feel?" Jessica smiled, leaning against her husband's shoulder. "Honestly, a little surreal. I keep thinking I'm going to wake up." "Not a chance," Michael replied, kissing the top of her head gently, careful not to disturb her veil. "I've got you now. Forever." A light breeze rustled through the garden, carrying the scent of roses and the distant sound of violins. The string quartet, a splurge that Jessica's father had insisted on, played softly in the background. "We should probably get back," Jessica said reluctantly. "People will wonder where we've gone." "Let them wonder," Michael replied with a mischievous grin, but he offered his arm to his bride anyway. "Ready to face the crowd, partner?" As they re-entered the ballroom, now transformed for the reception, a spontaneous round of applause broke out. The room looked magical, The afternoon sunlight fading into evening, the fairy lights beginning to twinkle against the darkening sky visible through the glass ceiling. Each table was set with fine china and crystal glasses that caught and reflected the light. Jessica's father had indeed spared no expense. Though not a wealthy man, James had been saving for his only daughter's wedding since the day she was born. A contractor by trade, he had called in favors from clients and friends alike to create the perfect day for his little girl. "Ladies and gentlemen," announced the DJ, a college friend of Michael's who had volunteered his services, "please welcome for their first dance as husband and wife Mr. and Mrs. Chen." The string quartet began to play their song, not a traditional wedding ballad, but the tune that had been playing the night Michael proposed at their favorite restaurant. Jessica had been completely surprised when Michael dropped to one knee beside their usual table, the same spot where they'd had their third date. Now, as they moved across the dance floor, the room seemed to fade away until it was just the two of them, swaying to the music that had become the soundtrack to their love story. "Remember when we practiced this in your mom's living room?" Jessica whispered, recalling how they'd knocked over a lamp during one particularly ambitious spin. "How could I forget? She still hasn't let me live it down," Michael replied with a chuckle. "But look at us now. Not a broken lamp in sight." As the song ended, Jessica's father approached for the traditional father-daughter dance. James, a man of few words, simply held out his hand with a soft smile that spoke volumes. "You know," he said quietly as they danced, "your mother and I couldn't have dreamed of a better match for you than Michael." "Thanks, Dad," Jessica replied, resting her head briefly against his shoulder, just as she had done as a little girl. "That means everything to me." The reception continued smoothly as dinner was served. The salmon was cooked to perfection, the roast beef tender and juicy. Even the vegetables, often an afterthought at wedding dinners, received compliments from the guests. At the head table, Jessica and Michael barely touched their food, too busy greeting well-wishers and soaking in the atmosphere of celebration. Tommy stood up occasionally to refill their water glasses, knowing they'd be too preoccupied to remember to drink. "You need to eat something," Tommy reminded Michael during a brief lull. "Trust me, you don't want to pass out before the honeymoon even starts." The newlyweds laughed, and Michael dutifully took a few bites of his dinner. Jessica did the same, suddenly realizing how hungry she actually was after the excitement of the day. As the main course was cleared away, the DJ invited guests to the dance floor. The string quartet took a well-deserved break as recorded music filled the room. Young and old alike got to their feet, inhibitions lowered by good food and the open bar. Jessica's younger cousins taught Michael's grandmother Dot a simplified version of a popular dance, much to everyone's delight. The elderly woman moved her hands in time with the music, beaming with joy as the children showed her the steps. "Now that," said Catherine to her husband, pointing to the heartwarming scene, "is what family is all about." James nodded in agreement, his arm around his wife's shoulders. After 30 years of marriage, they still sat close together, still found comfort in each other's presence. The cake cutting was announced, drawing everyone's attention to the four-tiered masterpiece decorated with sugar flowers that perfectly matched the real ones adorning the tables. Jessica and Michael stood before it, knife in hand, posing for photos. "Don't you dare smash that in my face," Jessica warned playfully, remembering Michael's joking threats during their cake tasting sessions. "Wouldn't dream of it," he replied with an innocent smile that fooled absolutely no one. But when the moment came, he was gentle, offering her a small bite with care and receiving the same in return. The crowd applauded as they sealed the moment with a kiss, frosting and all. As the evening progressed and the sky outside turned completely dark, the fairy lights above seemed to multiply, reflecting in the mirrored wall behind the head table and creating the illusion of an endless starry night. The atmosphere was magical, joyful, perfect in every way. No one could have guessed that this flawless celebration was about to take an unexpected turn, least of all the bride and groom, still wrapped in the blissful bubble of their perfect day. The dinner service was in full swing, the gentle clink of silverware against china plates mixing with the hum of conversation and occasional bursts of laughter. In the kitchen, Chef Paulo supervised his team with practiced precision, making sure each plate looked as perfect as the first. "Table 7 ready to go," he called, wiping a small droplet of sauce from the edge of a plate before nodding to the waiting server. Outside the main entrance of the Bellamy Ballroom, Peter, the venue's security guard, was enjoying the cool evening air. After 15 years working security at the historic building, he'd seen hundreds of weddings come and go. The Chen Wilson celebration was one of the smoothest he'd witnessed. The guests were well behaved, the vendors professional, and the weather perfect for an early summer evening. Peter checked his watch. Just past 8 o'clock. The night was young, but his shift would end at midnight, hopefully without incident. He took a final drag of his cigarette before crushing it under his heel and turning to head back inside. That's when he noticed the figure approaching from the shadows of the parking lot. The man moved with an odd combination of hesitancy and determination. His clothes were visibly worn, a faded brown jacket several sizes too large, patched jeans that had seen better days decades ago, and boots with soles so thin they barely qualified as footwear. His salt and pepper beard was untrimmed, his hair long and pulled back in a loose ponytail. On his back he carried a small weathered backpack that had once been blue, but had faded to an indeterminate grayish color. Peter straightened, immediately on alert. The Bellamy was in a good part of town, but occasionally people wandered over from the shelter 3 blocks away. "Evening, sir," Peter called out, positioning himself by the entrance. "Can I help you with something?" The man stopped about 10 feet away, his eyes, startlingly clear and blue, darting from Peter to the building behind him. Is this where the Wilson wedding is happening?" Peter's hand instinctively moved toward the radio on his belt. "This is a private event, sir. I'm afraid I'll have to ask you to move along." For a moment, something like pain flashed across the stranger's face. "Please," he said, his voice surprisingly soft and articulate. I just need to see something. Sir, like I said, this is a private event. If you don't leave the premises, I'll have to call the police." Peter kept his tone professional but firm, the way he'd been trained. The man seemed to deflate slightly, nodding as if he'd expected this response. "I understand. I'm sorry to bother you." He turned as if to leave, shoulders slumped. Peter watched him go, feeling the familiar mix of relief and guilt that came with these encounters. As the man reached the edge of the property, Peter turned to go back inside, making a mental note to do an extra perimeter check later. Inside, Jessica and Michael were making their rounds, stopping at each table to thank their guests personally. They had just reached the table where Michael's work colleagues were seated when Jessica's cousin Penny approached. "Jess, your dad's looking for you," she said, something about the photographer wanting to catch the sunset for some family shots. Jessica excused herself with a smile, squeezing Michael's hand before following Penny toward the garden doors where her father waited. Michael continued chatting with his co-workers, accepting their congratulations and answering questions about the honeymoon plans. Meanwhile, at the service entrance on the east side of the building, Lisa, one of the catering assistants, pushed open the door with her hip, balancing a tray of dirty dishes. The warm kitchen air rushed out into the cool evening, and she paused to enjoy the temperature difference for a moment. She nearly dropped her tray when a figure suddenly appeared beside her. "Excuse me," said the man, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't mean to frighten you. I just need to get inside." Lisa took in his appearance, the worn clothes, the tired eyes, the desperate expression, and immediately felt uneasy. "Sir, this is a private entrance for staff only. The main entrance is around front, but—" "I tried there," he interrupted gently. "The guard wouldn't let me in. Please, I'm not here to cause trouble. There's someone I need to see." Lisa hesitated. The man didn't seem threatening, just sad. But she knew the rules. "I'm sorry, I can't let you in. If you want, I can find the wedding planner and see if—" But before she could finish her sentence, the kitchen door opened again as another server came out for a smoke break. In that moment of distraction, the man slipped past Lisa and through the door. "Hey," she called, but he was already inside, moving with surprising speed for someone who had appeared so worn down. In the kitchen, Chef Paolo looked up in confusion as the stranger hurried through, navigating between the busy staff with unexpected agility. "Who the hell?" he began, but the man was already pushing through the swinging doors into the main ballroom, Jessica's. Father James was just leading the family back inside from their sunset photos when he noticed the commotion near the kitchen entrance. A disheveled man had emerged into the reception area and was scanning the room with an intense expression. Behind him, 2 kitchen staff and a server were in pursuit, trying to be discreet but clearly alarmed. "What's going on?" Catherine asked, following her husband's gaze. Before James could answer, the wedding planner, Charlotte, was already moving swiftly toward the situation, her professional smile never wavering, even as she gestured subtly to Peter, who had just re-entered the main room. Jessica and Michael, returning to their seats at the head table, remained blissfully unaware of the developing situation. Tommy, however, had noticed. He caught Michael's brother's eye across the room, giving a slight nod toward the commotion. They both began moving casually but purposefully to intercept, not wanting to disrupt the celebration but determined to handle whatever was happening. The unexpected visitor had paused near the edge of the dance floor, still searching the room. His gaze settled on the head table, and for a moment he seemed to freeze. His hand gripped the strap of his backpack so tightly that his knuckles turned white. By now, murmurs had begun to ripple through the closest tables. An elderly aunt clutched her pearls while a group of college friends stopped their conversation mid-sentence. The DJ, sensing the shift in atmosphere, smoothly transitioned to a new song, trying to maintain the festive mood. Peter approached the man from one side, while Charlotte intercepted him from the other. "Sir," Peter said firmly but quietly, "I need you to come with me." The man didn't seem to hear him. His eyes were fixed on Catherine, who was still standing with James near the garden entrance. Something in his expression shifted, a flash of recognition followed by what looked almost like fear. "Sir," Charlotte tried, her voice professional but kind, "this is a private event. If you could just step outside with us, we can talk about what you need." For the first time, the man seemed to register their presence. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "I didn't want to cause a scene. I needed to be sure." "Sure of what, sir?" Peter asked, his hand still hovering near his radio. The man's eyes returned to Catherine. "That it was really her," he whispered almost to himself. After all these years, by now Jessica had noticed the disruption. She turned in her seat, following the gaze of several guests, and saw the strange man standing at the edge of the dance floor. "Michael," she said, touching her husband's arm. "What's going on?" Michael stood, protective instinct kicking in. "Stay here," he said quietly. "I'll check it out." But before he could move, the DJ's voice came over the speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, it's time for the toasts. Would the best man please come up to the microphone?" Tommy, caught between responding to the DJ's call and dealing with the unexpected situation, hesitated. In that moment of confusion, the stranger made his move. With surprising quickness, he stepped forward, bypassing both Peter and Charlotte. He moved directly toward the small stage where the microphone stood, waiting for the best man's toast. The room fell into a confused silence as the man approached the microphone. Peter lunged forward but was too late. The stranger reached the mic first, grabbing it from its stand with trembling hands. Jessica stood frozen beside Michael, who had moved protectively in front of her. James started forward, but Catherine caught his arm, her face suddenly pale as paper. "I know I wasn't invited here," the stranger began, his voice echoing through the now silent ballroom. Despite his rough appearance, his speech was clear and educated. "And I'm truly sorry for interrupting your special day." Peter had reached the edge of the stage but paused, not wanting to create more of a scene by physically removing the man in front of all the guests. "I've been living on the streets for almost 8 years now," the man continued, his eyes scanning the crowd until they locked with Catherine's across the room. "But before that, I had a life, a family, a name." Catherine's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes widening in what looked like shock or recognition. 30 years ago, I made the biggest mistake of my life," the man said, his voice breaking slightly. "I left behind the people who mattered most to me, and I've been paying for it every day since." The wedding guests sat in stunned silence, uncertain whether they were witnessing a random intrusion or something more significant. Jessica looked from the stranger to her mother, confused by the intense emotion she saw in Catherine's face. The man's hands were shaking now, but his voice grew stronger. "I never thought I'd get a chance to make things right. But then yesterday I saw a small announcement in the local paper, a wedding announcement for Jessica Wilson, daughter of James and Catherine Wilson." He took a deep breath, tears now visibly welling in his eyes. "My name is Robert," he said, looking directly at Catherine again. "And 30 years ago, before I lost everything to addiction and pride, Catherine Wilson was my little sister, A stunned silence fell over the ballroom. The weight of Robert's words hung in the air as guests exchanged confused glances, unsure how to react to this unexpected revelation. Catherine stood frozen, her face drained of color, one hand still pressed against her mouth. Beside her, James wrapped a protective arm around his wife's shoulders, his expression a mixture of concern and suspicion. Jessica looked from the stranger to her mother, then back again. In all her 28 years, she had never heard her mother mention having a brother. There had been vague references to family troubles before Catherine met James, but never anything specific. Yet something in her mother's reaction told Jessica this wasn't simply a confused homeless man making false claims. Michael squeezed Jessica's hand, silently communicating his support. In the 5 years they'd been together, he'd never heard of an uncle either. Peter, the security guard, had reached the stage but hesitated, looking toward the bride and groom for some signal of how to proceed. Charlotte, the wedding planner, hovered nearby, clearly torn between removing the disruption and sensing that something significant was unfolding. Robert still held the microphone, his weathered hands trembling slightly. "I know this is the last thing anyone expected today," he continued, his voice cracking with emotion. "And I'm truly sorry for barging in like this. I tried to find you properly, Kathy, but every lead went cold." At the sound of the nickname, Catherine flinched visibly. Only her childhood family had ever called her Kathy. "If you want me to leave, I will," Robert said softly. He paused, struggling to find the words. "I just needed to see you one more time. To tell you I'm sorry. For everything." For several heartbeats, no one moved. Then slowly, Catherine stepped forward. James tried to hold her back, whispering something urgent in her ear, but she gently removed his hand and continued forward. "Robert," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, yet somehow carrying across the silent room. "Is it really you?" The man nodded, tears now streaming freely down his face and disappearing into his beard. "It's me, Kathy." Catherine took another step forward, her legs unsteady. "They told me you were dead," she said, her voice stronger now, tinged with disbelief and a hint of anger. 10 years ago. They said they found your body under a bridge in Detroit." Robert shook his head. "I was in pretty bad shape back then. Lost my ID in a shelter theft. Someone else died with my old driver's license in their pocket." He paused, swallowing hard. "By the time I found out, I was 2 states away and, well, it seemed easier to stay dead. I was a mess, Kathy. The drugs, the drinking." Jessica moved to her mother's side, taking her hand. "Mom," she asked softly, "what's going on?" Catherine seemed to remember where she was, looking around at the faces of her family and friends, all watching this unexpected drama unfold. She took a deep breath, squeezing Jessica's hand before releasing it. "Jessica, everyone," she said, her voice shaking slightly. This appears to be my older brother, Robert. I haven't seen him since before you were born." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Jessica's grandparents had passed away years ago, and she'd always believed her mother was an only child, just as she was. "I don't understand," Jessica said, looking between her mother and the man who claimed to be her uncle. "Why didn't you ever tell me I had an uncle?" Catherine's eyes filled with tears. "Because I thought he was gone forever," she said quietly. "First by choice, then. Then I thought by death." Robert stepped down from the stage, moving cautiously toward Catherine. Peter shadowed him, still uncertain but making no move to intervene. "I'm clean now," Robert said, directing his words to Catherine but speaking loudly enough for those nearby to hear. 5 years sober. It took hitting absolute rock bottom, but I made it back. Started looking for you 3 years ago, but the old house was gone, Mom and Dad had passed, and you'd changed your name when you married." He gestured vaguely toward his ragged appearance. "The homelessness. That's more recent. Lost my job during the economic crash, then my apartment. Been working odd jobs, saving what I can, trying to get back on my feet." He reached tentatively into his worn backpack, causing Peter to tense, but all he withdrew was a faded photograph. "I've carried this all these years," he said, holding it out to Catherine. "Remember that summer at Lake Michigan? Just before I left for college?" Catherine took the photo with trembling fingers. In the image, 2 teenagers stood on a dock, arms around each other's shoulders, laughing into the camera. The girl was unmistakably a younger version of Catherine, her hair longer but her smile exactly the same. The boy beside her was clean-shaven with short hair, but the eyes, those same startling blue eyes, were Robert's. "Oh my God," Catherine whispered. It really is you. The tension in the room shifted as guests realized this wasn't a random intrusion, but a family reunion unfolding before their eyes. James moved to stand beside his wife, his expression softening but still wary. "I have so many questions," Catherine said, looking up from the photo. "Where have you been all these years? Why now? How did you find us?" Robert gestured toward the small stage. "Maybe we should let these folks get back to their celebration," he said, suddenly self-conscious of the spectacle they were creating. "I never meant to hijack your daughter's wedding. When I saw the announcement in yesterday's paper with your name and the venue listed, I couldn't miss the chance." Jessica, who had been quietly taking in the scene, suddenly stepped forward. "Wait," she said firmly. "If you're really my mother's brother, that makes you my uncle." She studied his face, looking past the weathered skin and unkempt beard, focusing on his eyes that she realized with a jolt were shaped exactly like her own. "All my life, I thought Mom had no family left," Jessica continued. "I'm not about to send you away now that you're here." She turned to look at Michael, raising an eyebrow in silent question. Michael nodded without hesitation. "It's your day," he said simply. "And your family." Jessica turned back to Robert. "Uncle Robert," she said, testing the unfamiliar words. "Would you like to stay for the reception?" Robert's eyes widened in surprise. I couldn't possibly." "Look at me," he gestured to his disheveled appearance. "This is hardly appropriate attire for a wedding." "It's not about the clothes," Jessica said firmly. "It's about family." Catherine was still staring at the photograph, decades of memories and emotions playing across her face. "Robert," she said finally, looking up at her brother, "we have 30 years to catch up on. Please stay." The wedding guests had been watching the scene unfold with rapt attention. Now sensing the resolution, they began to murmur among themselves. Some wiped away tears moved by the unexpected reunion. Tommy, the best man, approached cautiously. "So, should I still give my toast?" he asked Michael quietly, trying to gauge how to proceed with the evening. Before Michael could answer, Catherine turned to address the room. "Everyone," she called, her voice stronger now. "I'm sorry for the interruption to the festivities. As you've gathered, this is indeed my brother, who I haven't seen in many, many years." She took a deep breath. "If you'll bear with us for a few more minutes, I think we could all use a drink and then we'll continue with the celebrations." A ripple of understanding laughter spread through the crowd. The DJ, sensing his cue, started the music again, a gentle background melody that helped ease the tension in the room. James, who had remained largely silent, finally extended his hand to Robert. "James Wilson," he said formally. "Catherine's husband of 30 years. Robert hesitated before shaking the offered hand. "I wish we could have met under better circumstances," he said. "I know this isn't exactly how you plan to spend your daughter's wedding day." "Life rarely goes according to plan," James replied, his expression still guarded but no longer hostile. "Why don't we find you somewhere to sit?" As the small family group moved toward an empty table near the back of the room, the wedding guests respectfully gave them space, while the celebration slowly resumed around them. The catering staff, who had been holding back during the confrontation, began serving dessert again. The dance floor remained empty for now, everyone too engrossed in discussing what they had just witnessed. Jessica held back, watching as her parents led her newly discovered uncle to a table. Michael slipped his arm around her waist. "Are you okay?" he asked softly. Jessica leaned against him, her mind racing with questions. "I think so," she replied. "It's just, all these years I thought I knew my family's story, and now you have an uncle you never knew existed," Michael finished for her. "It's a lot to take in." Jessica nodded, watching as Charlotte discreetly arranged for a plate of food to be brought to Robert. Despite his protests, it was clear he was hungry. "Do you want to join them?" Michael asked. Jessica took a deep breath. "In a minute. Let Mom have some time with him first." She turned to face her husband fully. "I'm sorry our perfect day got turned upside down." Michael smiled, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Are you kidding? This is going to be the wedding everyone remembers forever. And besides," he added, his expression softening, "seeing you stand up for family like that just reminds me why I fell in love with you in the first place." Jessica smiled, though her eyes still reflected her confusion. "I just wish I understood why Mom never told me about him." Some family wounds run deep, Michael said gently. But it looks like today might be the first step toward healing this one. Across the room, Catherine reached out and tentatively touched her brother's hand, tears streaming down her face as he spoke. For the first time since Robert had grabbed the microphone, she smiled, a smile tinged with sadness and wonder in 30 years of unspoken words. The wedding celebration continued around them, forever changed by an unexpected guest who had arrived with nothing but a worn backpack and a faded photograph, yet had managed to bring the most surprising gift of all. At a quiet table in the corner of the ballroom, Catherine sat across from her long-lost brother, 30 years of questions in her eyes. James remained protectively at her side while Jessica and Michael had joined them, wedding cake untouched on their plates as they listened to Robert's story unfold. "After Dad kicked me out that Christmas," Robert was saying, his fingers wrapped around a glass of water that Charlotte had brought him, "I just kept moving west. Thought I'd make it to California, start fresh where nobody knew me. Dad told me you'd called from Chicago," Catherine said quietly. "Said you told him not to try to find you." Robert nodded, shame evident in his downcast eyes. "I was so angry back then. Too proud to admit I was already struggling. The drinking had gotten worse in college, and by then I'd started with the pills, too." He took a sip of water, his hand trembling slightly. "I made it to Denver before the money ran out. Worked odd jobs, lived in a rundown apartment with 3 other guys." Jessica leaned forward, studying this stranger who was somehow her blood. "So what happened? Why didn't you ever come back or call again?" Robert's weathered face creased with regret. "The deeper I fell into addiction, the harder it seemed to reach out. Every year that passed, the gap just grew wider." He looked directly at Catherine. "I'd think about calling, especially on your birthday or Christmas, but then I'd imagine how disappointed everyone would be to see what I'd become." Catherine's eyes glistened with tears. "We would have helped you, Mom and Dad." Dad made it pretty clear where he stood. Robert interrupted, not unkindly. "After I dropped out of college and took the car money?" "Well, you remember what he was like. Once you disappointed him, it was hard to find your way back." James, who had been quietly listening, spoke up. "I never met your father, but from what Catherine has told me, he was a proud man. Stubborn, but not heartless," Robert nodded. "I know that now. Back then I was too caught up in my own pain to see it." He turned back to Catherine. "How were they at the end?" A shadow crossed Catherine's face. "Dad had his first heart attack 3 years after you left. It changed him, softened him somehow. He talked about you more in those last years, wondering where you were." She reached across the table, briefly touching Robert's hand. "Mom kept your room exactly the same until the day she died. She never gave up hope you'd come home." The weight of lost time hung heavy between them. Robert blinked rapidly, fighting back tears. Jessica broke the silence. "So how did you end up—" "You know." She gestured vaguely at his disheveled appearance, unsure how to politely ask how her uncle had become homeless. "On the streets?" Robert finished for her with a sad smile. "That's a more recent chapter. I actually got clean about 12 years ago. Had a decent job as a carpenter's assistant in Minneapolis. Even had a small apartment, nothing fancy, but it was mine." His expression darkened. "Then the economy crashed. Construction jobs dried up overnight. I held on as long as I could, but eventually lost the apartment. Spent some time in shelters, but they're overcrowded, especially in winter." "And that's when they mistakenly identified someone else as you?" Michael asked, trying to piece together the timeline. Robert nodded. "I'd lost my wallet in a shelter theft. Had my old driver's license, the one with my parents' address on it. Some poor guy froze to death under a bridge, had my ID on him." He sighed deeply. "By the time I found out I'd been declared dead, I was living in a tent community in Cleveland. Part of me thought it might be better that way. Let my family think I was gone instead of knowing I was still failing." Catherine's hand flew to her mouth. "We had a funeral," she whispered. "An empty casket. I mourned you, Robert." "I'm so sorry, Kathy," he said. Genuine remorse etched into every line of his face. "When I finally got back on my feet and tried to find you 5 years ago, I hit dead end after dead end. You'd moved, changed your name when you married. Our old house had been sold, but you kept looking," Jessica observed. A small smile touched Robert's lips. "I did, got sober again for good this time. 5 years clean now." He gestured toward his backpack, which sat on the floor beside him. "I carry my sobriety chip everywhere. It's the most valuable thing I own. As if on cue, Tommy approached their table, champagne bottle in hand. More champagne for the head table? He offered, trying to maintain some semblance of wedding normalcy. Jessica nodded gratefully, but Robert covered his glass with his hand. None for me, thanks. I don't drink anymore. Tommy nodded, filling the other glasses before retreating. Around them, the wedding reception had gradually resumed its rhythm. The dance floor was active again, though many guests still cast curious glances toward the family huddled in deep conversation. So yesterday's newspaper, James said, steering the conversation back. That's how you found out about the wedding? Robert nodded. I've been in town for about 3 weeks. Got a temporary job helping renovate a restaurant kitchen downtown. Been sleeping at the shelter on Pine Street. I check the papers every day, looking for work or, well, any connection to family. His eyes found Catherine's. When I saw Jessica Wilson, daughter of James and Catherine Wilson, in the announcement section with the venue listed, I knew it had to be you. But you didn't try to contact us before the wedding? Jessica asked. Robert's expression fell. I went to your house yesterday, saw the address in the phone directory, stood across the street for nearly an hour, trying to work up the courage to knock. He shook his head. But what was I going to say? Surprise. I'm your long-lost brother. Not dead after all, and by the way, can I clean up before your daughter's wedding tomorrow? Despite the gravity of the moment, Catherine let out a small laugh, quickly muffled by her hand. That would have been quite the doorstep conversation. So instead, you decided to crash the reception? Michael asked, though his tone held no judgment. I hadn't planned to come in at all, Robert admitted. I just wanted to see you, Kathy. Maybe catch a glimpse of your daughter on her wedding day. I was going to watch from outside, but then... He gestured vaguely at his appearance. The security guard wasn't exactly going to let me stroll in through the front door. So you snuck in through the kitchen, James finished. Robert nodded sheepishly. Not my proudest moment. When I saw the kitchen door open, I just acted on impulse. I'm sorry for disrupting everything. Jessica exchanged a look with Michael before turning back to her uncle. I think we're past apologies now, she said gently. The question is, what happens next? The four of them looked at Robert, who seemed suddenly at a loss for words. I hadn't thought that far ahead, he admitted. Honestly, I expected to be thrown out. Catherine reached across the table and took her brother's hand firmly in hers. You're not going back to that shelter tonight, she said, her voice leaving no room for argument. You're coming home with us. James nodded in agreement, though Jessica noticed a flicker of concern cross his face. Financial discussions would come later, she suspected. I can't impose, Robert began, but Catherine cut him off. Your family, Robert. We've lost 30 years. I'm not losing another day. Robert looked down at their joined hands, his sister's manicured fingers wrapped around his weathered ones. I don't deserve this kindness, he said quietly. It's not about deserving, Jessica said, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. It's about belonging. From across the room, the photographer approached cautiously, gesturing to Jessica and Michael. I'm sorry to interrupt, she said, but we're losing the light for those sunset photos you wanted. Michael looked at Jessica questioningly. She hesitated, torn between wedding obligations and this unexpected family reunion. Go, Catherine urged. We'll be right here when you get back. Jessica stood, smoothing her dress. Actually, she said, looking at Robert, I'd like to include my uncle in some of these photos. Robert's eyes widened in surprise. Me, but I'm hardly presentable? Jessica finished for him with a small smile. Maybe not, but you're still family. She looked to the photographer. Can we do a few quick family shots right here? My uncle has just reunited with my mom after many years, and I'd like to capture the moment. The photographer, a professional who had seen her share of wedding day dramas, nodded understandingly. Of course. The lighting is actually quite nice in this corner. As she set up her camera, Catherine moved to sit beside her brother, their shoulders touching for the first time in 3 decades. James stood behind them, his hand resting supportively on his wife's shoulder. Ready? The photographer asked, raising her camera. On 3, everyone say family. Robert's smile was hesitant at first, but as Catherine squeezed his hand, it grew more confident. When the flash went off, it captured a moment of healing that had been 30 years in the making. A broken family taking its first tentative steps toward becoming whole again. Across the ballroom, The DJ announced the father-daughter dance would begin in 5 minutes. The celebration continued, forever altered but not diminished by the unexpected guest who had arrived with nothing but a worn backpack and left with something far more precious: a second chance. The father-daughter dance began as James led Jessica onto the dance floor. The band played a gentle melody, the same song that had played at Catherine and James's wedding 30 years before. Guests circled the dance floor, phones raised to capture the moment. From their table in the corner, Catherine and Robert watched, both wiping away tears for entirely different reasons. "She looks so much like you," Robert said softly. "Same smile." Catherine nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. The day had already been emotional before Robert's appearance, and now she found herself overwhelmed by memories and possibilities. "Dad wanted a house full of kids, you know," she finally said. "But after Jessica, there were complications. The doctor said I couldn't have any more." She glanced at her brother. "I always wondered if that made losing you even harder." Robert reached for her hand. "I missed so much. Your wedding. Jessica growing up." "Well, you're here now," Catherine said firmly. "That's what matters." On the dance floor, James leaned close to Jessica's ear. "How are you holding up, sweetheart? This is a lot to take in on what should be your special day." Jessica looked over at her mother and newly discovered uncle. "Honestly, it feels right somehow, like a missing puzzle piece falling into place." She smiled up at her father. "Besides, this day was already special. Now it's just more memorable." As the song ended, James kissed Jessica's forehead before returning her to Michael's side. The band shifted to a more upbeat tune, and the dance floor quickly filled with guests eager to celebrate. Michael's father, David, approached the corner table where Robert sat with Catherine. David Chen was a practical man who had built his construction company from the ground up over 35 years. He had been watching the family drama unfold with thoughtful interest. "Mind if I join you?" he asked, pulling out a chair without waiting for a response. Robert straightened, suddenly self-conscious again about his appearance. "Of course not, sir." "David Chen," he said, extending his hand. "Michael's father." "Robert Wilson," Robert replied, shaking the offered hand. "Catherine's brother." David nodded, studying Robert with a contractor's eye, assessing, calculating, planning. "Catherine tells me you worked in construction before." "Carpenter's assistant?" Robert nodded, surprised. "For about 7 years in Minneapolis. Mostly residential projects, some commercial." "Still know how to frame a wall? Read a blueprint?" Robert's eyebrows rose slightly. "Yes, sir. Those skills don't really go away." David nodded thoughtfully. "My company's breaking ground on a new development next month. 40-unit apartment complex on the east side. Always need good workers who know what they're doing." He paused, letting his words sink in. "Pays fair. Benefits after 90 days. We could start you Monday." Catherine gasped softly beside them, but David raised a hand. "This isn't charity," he said firmly. "I don't hire people who can't pull their weight. But I do believe in second chances." He looked Robert directly in the eye. "If you're serious about staying, about being part of this family again, you'll need work." Robert stared at the older man, momentarily speechless. I don't know what to say." "Say yes," Catherine urged, squeezing his arm. "Please, Robert." Robert looked between them, eyes bright with unshed tears. "Yes," he said finally. "Yes, I'd be honored to work for you, sir." David nodded once, decisively. "Good. We'll need to get you some proper work clothes, steel-toed boots." He glanced at Robert's worn attire. "And maybe a haircut." For the first time that evening, Robert laughed. A rusty sound, as if long unused but genuine. "I think I'm due for one of those." Across the room, Jessica and Michael made their way back to the table, flushed from dancing. They arrived just in time to hear the exchange. "Did I just hear you offer my uncle a job, Dad?" Michael asked, his arm around Jessica's waist. David shrugged slightly. "The timing works out. We need experienced people for the riverfront project." But the slight twinkle in his eye betrayed his practical exterior. Jessica beamed at her new father-in-law, a man not known for sentimentality but whose practical kindness often spoke louder than words. "Thank you," she mouthed, silently over Robert's head. David gave a nearly imperceptible nod before turning back to Robert. "You'll need a place to stay while you get on your feet. The company owns a few apartments we use for out-of-town workers. Small studio, nothing fancy, but it's clean and furnished. It's yours if you want it, rent-free for the first month while you save up a deposit." Robert shook his head in disbelief. I don't know how I'll ever repay this kindness. Work hard, David said simply. That's all I ask. The evening continued, the initial shock of Robert's appearance gradually giving way to acceptance as the story spread among the guests. Some approached the table cautiously, curious to meet this long-lost uncle who had dramatically returned from the presumed dead. Tommy, ever the loyal best man, brought over a plate piled high with food. Figured you might be hungry, he said, setting it before Robert. The salmon is excellent. Robert thanked him, suddenly realizing he hadn't eaten all day. As he took his first bite, he closed his eyes briefly, savoring the taste of real food after too many meals from soup kitchens and convenience stores. Later, as the reception began winding down, Jessica found herself alone with Robert for a moment while Catherine and James spoke with departing guests. I want to apologize again, Robert said quietly. This was your special day and I turned it into something else entirely. Jessica shook her head. You know, when I was little, I used to make up stories about having a big family. I'd imagine cousins and aunts and uncles at Christmas dinner. She smiled softly. I was always a bit lonely being an only child. Your mom was too, Robert said. That's why we were so close growing up, until I messed everything up. Well, now you have a chance to fix it, Jessica said, and I finally get to have an uncle. Better late than never, right? Robert studied his niece's face, marveling at the family resemblance he could now clearly see. You have a very generous heart, Jessica. I get that from my mom, she replied with a smile. And apparently it runs in the family. The wedding photographer approached them again. I have a few more shots I'd like to get before we lose all the light, she said. Would the bride and her uncle mind stepping outside for a moment? The garden lighting is perfect right now. Jessica looked questioningly at Robert, who hesitated. I'm hardly dressed for formal photos, he began. It's not about the clothes, Jessica said, echoing her earlier words. It's about the moment. This is part of our story now. In the garden, with the setting sun casting a golden glow over the roses, the photographer captured a series of images that told a story beyond words. An uncle and niece meeting for the first time. The 3 decades of separation somehow visible yet bridged in their shared smiles. When they returned inside, Michael's mother Linda approached with a small gift bag. I hope you don't mind, she said to Robert. I had an extra dress shirt and tie in the car, Michael's from when he was deciding what to wear this morning. She offered the bag. They should fit you. For the final dances and send-off. Robert accepted the bag with humble gratitude. Thank you. Charlotte, ever the efficient wedding planner, directed him to a small private bathroom where he could change. When Robert emerged 20 minutes later, he had not only changed his shirt but had also managed to trim his beard and tie back his hair with a borrowed ribbon. The transformation wasn't complete. His jeans were still worn, his hands still weathered mud, but the man who rejoined the reception looked considerably more like a wedding guest than the disheveled stranger who had crashed at ours. Before Catherine gasped softly when she saw him. There you are, she whispered. I can see you now. The DJ announced the last dance of the evening. As Michael led Jessica to the floor one final time, other couples joined them, James and Catherine, David and Linda, and many of the wedding guests. Would you like to dance? Came a gentle voice beside Robert. He turned to find Jessica's cousin Penny smiling at him. Everyone should dance at a wedding, she added. For the first time that evening, Robert stepped onto the dance floor, moving awkwardly at first but gradually finding the rhythm. From across the room, Catherine watched her brother with tears in her eyes, seeing glimpses of the young man he had been before addiction took him away. As the song ended, the DJ announced it was time for the bride and groom's departure. Guests lined up outside holding sparklers that lit the night with golden light. Jessica and Michael ran through the tunnel of light toward their waiting car, laughing and stopping for one final kiss that drew cheers from the crowd. Before climbing into the car, Jessica broke away for a moment. Rushing back to where Robert stood with Catherine and James, she hugged him tightly. Welcome home. Uncle Robert, she whispered. Then she was gone, whisked away to begin her married life, leaving behind a family forever changed by an unexpected guest. Later that night, as Catherine and James prepared to drive Robert to their home, the first step in a journey of healing and reconnection, Charlotte approached them with a thin package. The photographer wanted you to have this, she said, handing it to Catherine. She said sometimes the most beautiful moments aren't the ones we plan. Inside was a single photograph printed and framed on the spot. It showed the entire family during the reception, Jessica and Michael, Catherine and James and Robert, all together at the table, their faces illuminated by candles and hope. Despite Robert's worn clothes, despite the day's drama, what shone through most clearly was the sense of completeness. A family circle that had been broken for 30 years, finally made whole again. It's perfect, Catherine said, clutching the frame to her chest as they walked toward the car. Absolutely perfect. Behind them, the Bellamy ballroom glowed in the darkness, the last lights being extinguished as staff cleared away the remnants of a wedding that had begun as one kind of celebration and ended as another. A celebration not just of new beginnings, but of finding what had once been lost.